Today we're analyzing the clinical data on atrial fibrillation. What is the single defining characteristic of atrial fibrillation in the general population?
It's still the most common sustained tachyarrhythmia, and its incidence just rises dramatically with age. The highest prevalence is definitely in patients older than 70.
That age factor really is primary. And interestingly, the data shows a clear disparity. So what is the sex disparity when it comes to prevalence and, maybe more importantly, stroke risk?
Well, atrial fibrillation is actually more common in males.
Okay.
But, and this is the critical point, for risk, females have a greater baseline risk of stroke.
Right, that's a key distinction. What are the two main electrophysiologic theories that drive this chaotic rhythm?
Okay, so the first is what we call the multiple wavelet hypothesis. It basically describes multiple concurrent reentry foci just spreading chaotically all through the atrial muscle.
A total electrical storm.
Exactly. The second theory, which has really big implications for intervention, is focal initiation and maintenance.
Focal initiation.
Yeah. This usually involves localized triggered activity and micro reentry, and it very commonly originates near the pulmonary veins.
Why there? Why the pulmonary veins specifically? It seems so, specific.
It's an anatomical thing. There's often a little sleeve of atrial tissue that extends into the pulmonary veins.
I see.
And that provides the perfect substrate for this triggered activity, especially these rapid-firing ectopic beats that can just degenerate into AFib.
Which is why ablation so often targets that exact area.
That's precisely why pulmonary vein isolation is the goal.
Okay, so knowing the trigger helps, but we also have to know which 6 underlying clinical conditions most commonly cause or perpetuate atrial fibrillation.
They are systemic hypertension, coronary artery disease, cardiomyopathy, valvular heart disease, hyperthyroidism, and hypoxia.
You see a really strong overlap there with major cardiovascular issues.
That's a very strong overlap.
And we can't forget the external factors. Beyond those chronic conditions, which 2 classes of substances can kick off an acute episode?
Alcohol and sympathomimetics.
Yep.
The effects of alcohol, increasing sympathetic tone and altering refractoriness, they're very well documented.
Holiday heart syndrome.
The classic example.
So when patients present, the picture can vary a lot. What is the most common symptom they report, even if a lot of cases are totally asymptomatic?
Palpitations. That's number 1.
Okay.
But you have to watch for other signs of decompensation, things like chest pain, dyspnea, and even syncope, especially in patients with poor ventricular function to begin with.
And when that rhythm goes chaotic, the whole system suffers. Can you describe the core hemodynamic consequences?
Yeah, there are 2 immediate effects. First, you lose that synchronous atrial contraction, what we call the atrial kick.
Right.
And second, the ventricular diastolic filling time just plummets because the heart rate is so fast.
And losing that atrial kick, that alone can drop cardiac output by what, 20 or 30%?
Easily. In some volume-sensitive patients or those with heart failure, it's a huge hit. That combination also impairs coronary blood flow, which increases the risk for ischemia.
The ECG is still our definitive tool here. What are the 3 classic findings on an ECG for atrial fibrillation?
First, the absence of P waves. Second, you'll see an undulating or wavy baseline.
Fibrillation waves.
Right, sometimes just find fibrillation waves. And third, the hallmark, an irregular RR interval. The rate is usually somewhere between 120 and 160 if it's untreated.
Okay, here's a scenario that can be a real trap. If the RR intervals look regular but you still don't see any P waves, what should you immediately suspect?
That pattern should make you think of atrial fibrillation with a complete heart block.
Okay.
What you're seeing is a regular escape rhythm that's taken over pacing the ventricles. It's a massive red flag for drug toxicity.
Like too much beta blocker.
Exactly. Over-medication with a beta blocker or a calcium channel blocker is the classic cause. That escape rhythm is all they have.
Shifting to the long game, the biggest concern isn't just the rate, it's the fallout. What's the main long-term risk that really drives all our management decisions?
It's a predisposition to stasis and forming atrial thrombi, especially in the left atrial appendage.
Which leads to stroke.
And subsequent systemic embolization, yes, primarily stroke.
This directly impacts our acute approach. So let's talk about the hard stop for intervention. What's the time cutoff for considering cardioversion in the ED?
You should not consider cardioversion, electrical or pharmacologic, if the AFib has been going on for more than 48 hours.
Unless
the patient is hemodynamically unstable. That's the only exception.
And that 48-hour rule exists because the clot risk just goes way up.
It goes up significantly.
Yeah.
After 2 days, the chance of a mobile thrombus is high enough that if you convert them, you risk launching that clot right into their brain or somewhere else.
So if the onset time is unknown and the patient is stable, we have to assume it's been longer than 48 hours.
Absolutely. If it's ambiguous, you assume the worst. And that means you control the rate, and then you plan for either 3 weeks of anticoagulation or a transesophageal echo to rule out a clot before you even think about rhythm conversion.
Okay. Now, that decision for long-term stroke prevention is formalized. Based on the CH2 DS2 VS6 score, when is long-term anticoagulation recommended?
It's necessary for a score of 2 or greater.
Let's just quickly run through those points. Break down the CH2 DS2 VS6 score for us.
Okay. Congestive heart failure is 1 point. Hypertension, 1 point. Age 75 or greater is 2 points.
A big one.
A very big one. Diabetes is 1 point. A prior stroke, TIA, or thromboembolic event is another critical 2 points.
It's the other heavy hitter.
Right. Then vascular disease is 1 point. Age 65 to 74 is 1 point. And finally, female sex is 1 point.
So if you look at that age over 75 or a prior stroke, they carry the heaviest weight. One of those puts a patient at high risk immediately.
Instantly. It means an immediate, mandatory discussion about therapeutic anticoagulation, assuming no major contraindications. A prior stroke especially tells you the patient has already proven they can form these clots.
Okay, moving to acute treatment, the decision is made to control the rate. What's the typical initial goal for ventricular rate control?
The initial target is actually pretty lenient, a ventricular rate of 110 beats per minute or less.
So we're not aiming for a normal sinus rate.
No, not at all. We just want symptom relief and adequate diastolic filling time.
And for this, we mainly rely on 2 big drug classes. Can you name the primary agents?
We use the class 2 antiarrhythmics, which are the beta blockers like metoprolol or esmolol, and the class 4 antiarrhythmics, the calcium channel blockers, mainly diltiazem.
Diltiazem is often the go-to because it's fast. But is there a situation where a beta blocker is the preferred agent no matter what?
Yes, if the underlying cause is thyrotoxicosis.
Ah.
In that case, a beta blocker is preferred because it not only controls the rate, but it also blocks the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3, so it's actually treating the underlying hormonal drive.
What about the patient with decompensated heart failure, severely reduced ejection fraction? We have to be really careful there. When is a class 3, like amiodarone, considered for rate control?
Amiodarone is often reserved for those patients. The ones with decompensated heart failure where a beta blocker or calcium channel blocker would just be too dangerous because of the negative inotropy.
And the risk with amiodarone?
The main cautions are drug-related hypotension and the possibility of unintended pharmacologic cardioversion, which brings us right back to that 48-hour rule and stroke risk.
Right. And what about an option for a hypotensive patient? Is there anything that's a bit safer but maybe has a drawback?
That would be digoxin. It doesn't cause as much acute negative inotropy, which is good, but its onset of action is so delayed that it's really a poor choice for immediate rate control in the ED.
Okay, let's consider a chronic patient. If someone with stable, compliant fib suddenly presents with a rapid ventricular response, what should we be thinking?
That's a huge clinical clue. It suggests their AFib is a compensatory response to some acute severe stressor.
So you're not just treating the rate.
You are absolutely not just treating the rate. You have to immediately search for an underlying cause. Is it blood loss, sepsis, a pulmonary embolism? You have to treat that primary problem first.
Let's shift to rhythm control. For the stable patient with a known duration of less than 48 hours, which class 1 and class 3 agents are commonly used?
The main class 1 agent is procainamide. For class 3, we use amiodarone or ibutylide.
And how successful are they?
Well, they all have pretty similar success rates for conversion, somewhere in the range of 40 to 50%.
So about a coin flip.
Yeah, which tells you that electrical cardioversion has to be your backup plan.
One of those drugs, ibutylide, requires prolonged monitoring. Why is that?
Because of the serious risk of inducing torsades de pointe and polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. Anyone given ibutylide must be monitored for at least 4 hours after the infusion. It's a critical safety step.
If drugs fail or the patient is unstable, we move to electricity. What's the standard energy level for synchronized electrical cardioversion?
We typically use biphasic cardioversion, starting at 100 to 200 joules.
And even in that unstable setting, we still have to think about clots. What anticoagulation measure is advised?
Ideally, heparin should be started before the cardioversion if you have time, but it definitely needs to be continued if the conversion is successful.
And before you deliver that shock, are there any conditions that increase the risk of a bad outcome, like a post-conversion arrhythmia?
Yes, 2 big ones are hypokalemia or digitalis toxicity. You have to aggressively check for and correct those right before you convert to reduce the chance of a malignant rhythm afterwards.
Okay, let's synthesize the key pillars here.
So management really depends heavily on two things: duration, that 48-hour cutoff, and the patient's hemodynamic stability. For acute rate control, the goal is a lenient one, 110 beats per minute or less.
And long-term planning starts immediately with risk stratification. That CHA2DS2 VASC score is so important. A score of 2 or greater means you must consider anticoagulation.
Absolutely. So I'll leave you with a final thought to consider. Large trials have shown that while calcium channel blockers might get you to your target heart rate a bit faster than beta blockers, there's no difference in meaningful long-term outcomes, like mortality or hospitalization.
Okay, so speed isn't everything.
It isn't. So what does this mean for your decision process? It suggests that if the patient has another reason to be on a beta blocker, say coronary artery disease,
You should probably prioritize that one.
you should prioritize the beta blocker, even if it takes a little longer to titrate the rate. It allows you to focus on the overall clinical picture, not just the race to a number.
Knowledge applied is the outcome. That is all for this focused review.